Well, welcome everybody, and I'll turn this over now to your board members who will entertain whatever it is that you will tell them.
So thanks so much. I think I'll just kick things off real quick. I'm Ruth Adkins. I live a block from here, and I've had the honor of being the board representative from Zone 1, i.e. Wilson Cluster, and a little slice of Southeast since 2007. And then with me are Belisle and Bobbie Regan, who also sit on the board. But I've been asked as kind of the nominal host living a block from here to just kind of go over the introduction piece real quick, and then we'll get into it. A little louder. Sorry, and then we'll get into your questions and answers. I would ask folks to go ahead and move on up to, I will try to speak up, but definitely don't be afraid of us. We won't bite. So we've got staff here who are going to be recording your questions, and I can guarantee that I at least will not have answers to everything that comes up tonight. So we will, they have committed that they're going to follow up within a week to get the answers out to these questions that may come up that we aren't able to answer tonight. We do ask that folks keep your comments or questions to about 60 seconds in length if you can, just so as many people as possible tonight will have a chance to weigh in. And we do ask that each person ask their one question and let others ask before they come back and ask a second question. Again, just so we can get to everybody who wants to have their say. And obviously we need to be respectful of each other's views and opinions. We all feel very passionately about our kids and our schools and our community, and we just want this to be a place where we can express different points of view and respect each other in that. So with that, I think there's, if anyone needed interpretation or childcare, I think that was on the sign-in out there. Is everyone okay from that perspective? Okay, we really appreciate you all coming out tonight. Obviously there's a million other things you could be doing with your time. So we greatly appreciate that you've taken the time to come out tonight, and we're really happy to be here to attempt to answer, or at the very least to hear your questions and comments and concerns, suggestions, whatever it is you've brought with you tonight. So just before we launch into the question and answers, we did want to do a quick few minutes really quickly around a new campaign that's a grassroots campaign to build support for public education going into the 2015 legislative session. As you probably know, in the last session we got a very welcome turnaround in education funding that helped us begin to start rebuilding back our public schools, and we really need to keep the pressure on to make public school funding a priority. So the Promise of Oregon campaign is what this is called. It's a statewide grassroots campaign. It's been funded by the Oregon School Boards Association, the statewide organization, which our very own Bobbie is the president-elect incoming, and has been super active for years building relationships around the state with other school boards. So the goal, again, is it's a campaign that's going to feature students. We've got a really short video to show you. I think there's some sign-in sheets if anyone is interested in finding out more or how you can get involved. But it's the campaign will feature students, including a bunch from PPS. And again, the goal is to remind legislators of the importance of public schools for our students and for the future of our state. So with that, unless there's anything else, maybe we could watch the video real quick. And
it's just a 1-minute primer. It's going to be rolled out in the full campaign in November.
Anyone want to start off?
I'll be brave.
Yes, ma'am. Neighbor, hi.
I'm a strong believer in hands-on education, particularly outdoor education for learning science. And we have a wonderful program for that called Outdoor School, but now it's only happening, the sixth graders only go for half a week. And so I think I would like to see the district go back to the full week. And I just wanted to remind you, I know it costs over $1 million, but you know, one day of that is paid for by Metro, one day paid by the parents whose kids go, one day, or a half a day is this year being paid for by Soil and Water Conservation District. So there are a lot of other pots of money, so the district wouldn't be paying the whole amount. So my question is, who can I work with in the administration to make this happen?
I think you're basically going to end up working with the board probably, because my guess is in the budget cycle, this will be one of the things that comes up as a potential priority. And I think that you've seen the board talking quite a bit recently, wanting to have lots of experiential, project-based, hands-on learning opportunities. So Outdoor Schools is, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, is a program, it's a 5-day program for 6th graders. And they basically go away, and it's four nights, 5 days, and they go away.
It used to be that long.
And it's also, other Multnomah County school districts participate as well. While it has incredible benefits for our sixth graders, it also has incredible benefits for high school students who end up often volunteering as counselors, and many of them actually learn that they love to teach and often become teachers as a result of that experience. But it's incredible leadership opportunities for our high school kids also. So during the 10 years up until last year of budget cuts, that was one of the things that we had considered cutting completely, and we didn't do that. In part, if Portland Public Schools were to cut out of that program completely, it would probably go away completely, because we are the anchor school. And I know for myself, I would absolutely love to have it come back to a full 5-day program again. I think it's an incredible experience for kids. And it's a real equalizer for a lot of kids, especially some of our high poverty kids. They've never had the experience of being out in the wilderness and camping. I mean, it's experiential on so many levels, including deep, deep science, and just an opportunity to get to know kids from, all walks of life.
Yeah, well said. So, next.
And I'll just mention that my daughter is there right now.
Hopefully not getting rained on.
She's about to get rained on.
Yeah, but
That's all part of the
part of
experience.
the experience. So I think Mike was next.
Perhaps our school, those other partners, did they come in when the cuts started, or are they long-term funders? And then what would the Portland Public Schools cost be to restore to a full week?
I had been told that the cost for Portland Public School would be about $1 million, so I'm not exactly sure what the number is or if that includes the partners or not. We do have several partners who participate with us, including Metro and including Friends of Outdoor School, and including parents. Parents do pay some to participate. In the scope of things, it's not a huge amount of money, but $1 million is 10 teachers too. So I mean, that's what you do when you're looking at budgets, is you figure out where you're going to prioritize. So I don't know that we have a consensus on the board at this point that we will definitely bring that back. I know it's already been suggested by several board members that we are very interested in bringing it back. So I hope you'll participate in the board meetings during budget cycle too.
And my understanding was that it was primarily just school district funded. And then as year after year, as budgets got smaller and smaller, it kept coming up as something to cut. And that's when communities, there's Friends of Outdoor School, parents began to rally, Metro came in, soil conservation. Everybody began to realize the value that it had beyond just K-12 education. So I think that's when they came in.
So next question. Oh,
Just a point of information, Rex Burkholder, who used to be Metro counselor, is trying to get statewide funding through, I'm sorry, I can't remember the nonprofit that he's working through.
Yeah.
That would be amazing.
To do with that. Not to let you guys off the hook.
No.
Oh, we wouldn't want to do that. So I think,
We couldn't think of anything else to spend
yeah,
money.
Michael is next, I think.
So it seems to me that technology has potential to be a great force multiplier for our limited number of teachers to help students learn. I see very little of it, particularly here at Wilson High School. Where does that fit in the board's priorities?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the pieces where what we need to be able to have staff do is step back and kind of do an audit or a census of what is available across the district. I know just recently Principal Chattard here at Wilson just did the Trojan Throwdown and raised additional money because there really was, to get Chromebooks, which are less expensive and very useful to have in the building, in mobile carts. So I think that is an area where it's time for us to be able to, now that we're finally getting out of the budget cuts mode, to be able to, I would like to be able to see kind of what is available across the district, whether it's between district investment, grants, fundraising, other pieces, what's kind of our status quo, and then where are there still gaps going forward, because it's definitely been uneven.
Well, and we, just this last funding year, as budgets have improved, we just bought a whole bunch of tech bundles for all of our teachers. We're making another investment with this additional money that we didn't realize was going to be there. In addition to that, we've looked, the couple of years that I've been on the board, we've looked at online learning, trying to figure out how do we use that across. And so we've right now prioritized folks who are credit deficient, and so how do we get them up? But what we also realized as we looked at other school districts and other schools that are doing this is there's this kind of belief that couldn't you have one teacher and 60 students? And what winds up is the students, especially that struggle, you can't do that. They still need that regular check-in, and that becomes too many. So we're still wrestling with how do we use that to its multiplier effect. But I still think it's a priority. And again, I believe that we're about to invest in a small amount of money. I think it's $200,000 in an audit of our technology, because we also realize that we're not even clear what's in our buildings anymore. And we need to get a handle on that, as Ruth was saying, so that we can move forward.
I'd say another piece of that, though, is making sure that we have people in every school who can actually work on and maintain our technology, and that's as big an issue as the technology itself, is making sure they're all operational. So it isn't just the expense of the computer or the software, but it's also the ongoing expense of keeping it up to speed. So.
And of course, not just computers or Chromebooks or iPads, but I think even smart boards are now getting to be outdated, so I'm dating myself by even mentioning that, but other tools for teachers. It just always sticks with me. It was actually several years ago, but going into George Middle School and seeing, I think it was a math class, and doing geometry on the smart board and how the kids were interacting. I was also over at Chief Joe. It's happening in a lot of buildings, but we need to make sure that the tools are available in all our buildings as we start to continue to rebuild from the years of disinvestment.
Thank you.
So Will.
On that theme briefly, one concern is that technology is not machines. It's a way of learning, and if we don't have the integrated curriculum and overall preparation, you're spending money going on a rat hole, basically. I have another concern around resources, which has to do with the way it's allocated across the city. Kids with special needs that are not making it for various reasons definitely need priority. However, their ability to get that depends on where they live in the city. In the Southwest, where we have relatively few kids, 1 in 5, there are thousands of kids who have a relatively small percentage of the resources. Thought towards something that gets a child-specific rather than school-specific services would help us get a better handle. Along those lines, there's always the issue of how much money is available. I've lost touch with, as of today, I've lost a lot of touch. As of today, compared to back before Measure 5, how are we doing in Portland Public Schools in adequate per pupil funding to make these things happen? Are we ahead, behind, how much behind, and where are we?
Well, I think as a percentage of the state budget,
We're at like 39%.
yeah, I think we're down. It's just barely started to creep back up from. So I think it maybe made it back up to 40%. That might be on one of those. And then we get roughly, I believe it's 8% of whatever the statewide number is through the unbelievably complex formula that they have, as you know. So I would say again, it's been going down like this, and then we're just beginning to turn the corner.
So, and I mean, I'm just thinking that if you're really looking for inflation-adjusted dollars from before Measure 90 and then now, I mean, I wouldn't have that off the top of my head. But I think that we can get it and put it up because it's worth looking at.
Well, and just the state's own, I feel like a broken record on this, but the state's own quality education model, we are still, and Otto, you probably know what percentage we're finally.
It's around $2 billion short.
Yeah, we're around 2 billion.
With the improved.
Right, we're 75% of the what's called the quality education model, which people say shouldn't every kid have music? Shouldn't every kid have art? Shouldn't every kid have PE? Shouldn't every kid? Yes. And the state cost that out and figured out what it would cost for every school district, and that's what
But
Otto was
only to get 90% of students to benchmark.
Only get 90% of students, right? So
Not
that's
100% graduation, not 100% anything.
$2 billion more than we have now, which is about 75% of the school of the funding.
Hence the concern and the need for our grassroots campaign to really remind legislators, yes, you were awesome last session. It was great. Thank you for the additional funding, but we're not done yet as a state. Obviously, this relates to a larger question or a larger debate around tax reform to be able to move forward. A little above our pay grade, but it's a huge part of the mix. I know a lot of you have been out there toiling in the trenches for decades on this issue. I mean, I had a baby in a sling in Salem who's now out in the workforce. But so be it. We have to just keep at it.
So the other thing to keep in mind in terms of funding is that we also provide funding at the local level through a local levy. And I think that we've had a levy in place so long that people don't realize how many teachers it actually pays for. So right now, our current local levy pays for 600 teaching positions. That's almost a quarter of our teachers in Portland Public Schools are paid for with local dollars. You know, some would argue that we shouldn't have to put in local dollars, that it is the state's responsibility to educate our children, but that tells you how far behind we are. And just so you know, we are going out for an early renewal of our local levy, and that's been confusing for people because we just passed it in 2011. We passed it overwhelmingly in 2011. But the reason we're going out is we discovered that a portion of our local levy now that's collected in urban renewal areas in Portland, those monies are actually staying in the urban renewal areas. And so urban renewal has been getting a windfall from our local teacher levy. And we went to the city and they agreed with us. We went to the state with them and we got that law changed, but it's only for levies going forward. So we are going out in November, just so everyone knows, to renew our teacher levy early the exact same rate. And we'll end up with about another $4.5 million to pay for teachers next year, which will be another 40 or 50 teachers for next year, which is a pretty big deal. So just so you know that.
Yeah, I think you have
Okay, so actually Mr. Belisle just touched on this about the inequities, about music, but I think we have a particularly bad one here in Portland. My child goes to Capitol Hill Elementary where there is no music. The principal has decided that they'd have a full-time art teacher. So you get that arts tax thing that has happy kids playing instruments and, well, not my kid. I'm a music teacher in Beaverton where we have 90 minutes of PE and 90 minutes of music every week mandated by the school board. So my question is to you, or my suggestion to you is, as a school board, should principals have that kind of discretion when it could be the overwhelming majority of parents that want maybe to have half and half, or because we have a full-time art teacher. You know, we've offered survey monkeys and stuff, but I don't think our principal, and I think there's other ones, really want to know with what they have going on. Plus, and I would encourage everyone to read the Wall Street Journal's article this last week about a musical fix for schools. The research overwhelmingly shows for math and science test scores and reading test scores how it can improve. But there isn't really much research that says iPads in the hands of kindergartners in primary grades, K1, 2 does. But we're spending a lot of money on that too. So I encourage the board to take a look at the inequities district-wide about music. Even once a week would make me happy, frankly. But to have none is in some schools, and then have district-funded, not just PTO, but district-funded money paying for K-8s and stuff seems pretty inequitable. So I encourage you to take a look.
Yeah, thanks for raising that. I mean, I think that's been one of the challenges for a long time is figuring out what is that balance between the individual discretion at the school level versus sort of mandating district-wide, and we haven't found that perfect balance for sure, especially in what's been a cuts environment for a long time. So I think, you know, one of the pieces, I don't know if you're familiar that PSU, Portland State, is assisting us with not just, it started out as sort of we need to do district-wide boundary review, and what they came back with after talking to a lot of folks both within the district and out in the community was it's not just about boundaries. You need to talk about programs, what's available in different schools, what should be available, what should the configurations be post K-8 several years in. So that's going to be a huge challenge for us to take on, but I think a really, really important piece, thankfully with PSU's help, because they're amazing, to be able to do, just to have that greater kind of transparency and accessibility to understand. There's a lot of data about it, but it's not always easy for the public to find or for parents to see. And again, to have that conversation more about what is that balance between local decision-making versus district-wide.
Well, and I think Portland has struggled with that sometimes more than others. If you mandate it from central district, this is just something that we're doing. Oftentimes we get this big roar of like, oh my gosh, central office, get out of schools. My school knows what's best. Stop mandating to the... And then what happens is when we let it go, right, then we hear the other folks and people say, what are you doing? How can you have these inequities? How can... And so it's two coins. And what I've seen, if I look at a district right to our east, like David Douglas, who has band, orchestra, and choir K-6, they committed to it all the way through the recession, all the way through it. What they gave up was class size. So they had first, second, third graders with 35 kids, 36 kids. That hasn't been the value that I've heard consistently from our community. And so I do think that it's a community conversation, because I know that there are some places I go and I hear just as adamantly, visual arts has to be in there. How can that possibly be an option? Music, yes, but it needs to be visual arts. So I think the struggle is having those tensions and then having a place which we hope this district boundary will get us to enough community members to have that conversation so that we can land comfortably somewhere or uncomfortably somewhere, but realize that there are multiple viewpoints to it.
The other thing too is loss of capacity at the central office, and just in terms of having a strategic vision and plan for what are we gonna do with all the arts, with athletics, all the other pieces that have been cut and chipped away at year after year. And honestly, when you lose that capacity, then there isn't someone whose job it is. It falls off the radar, and we're all, none of us would disagree. We all would want our kids to all have visual arts and music and dance and PE and everything else. But we need to be able to build that back.
In full disclosure, as I pointed out to you, I'm a music teacher. I couldn't agree more that it's fundamental to everybody and everything, that it's not an extra, that it will actually help improve. So this isn't me trying to step out of or try to get out of something, but it is acknowledgement that when I talk to different people, I hear different sets of priorities, and that's what I think we struggle with.
I would also say, in terms of the arts tax in Portland, that was K-5. We did hire a arts TOSA in the district, a teacher on special assignment, and the job of the arts TOSA is to figure out how we're going to articulate all the way up through high school, starting with K-5, because you don't want your kids to have art or music K-5, and then in 6th grade there's nothing there anymore. And so that's also going to be one of the things. When we just had the additional monies that came in, one of the big conversation topics was, for one-time money, was could we buy some musical instruments? And can we start looking at that at the middle school level? Because, our kids are so far behind other suburban districts. If the other districts are doing music starting at, or band and orchestra starting in middle school, when our kids are touching an instrument for the first time in 9th grade, it's crazy.
Right.
So, it is one of these things that we're looking to build back and articulate all the way through the system.
Exactly. I
We
think
have a long way to go.
Sorry. So here and then here.
I was just going to add, my child's also at Capitol Hill, also in 1st grade, and we have 30 kids in his class. So, not that much different from David Douglas, where they have music, have obviously more children, which none of us want.
Yeah.
But our building is also at max capacity.
Right.
So, and all we keep hearing is, but we don't have a room for music. We don't have a room to add a teacher, even if we had the money.
Right.
So, as a new family to the school, it's been very frustrating, and I can see the frustration on the teacher, and she's an amazing teacher. It breaks my heart to see, worksheets being passed out instead of actually engaging students. It breaks my heart. We agree.
So we added, this year, we were able to add about 200 additional teachers. You'll hear the number a lot that there are 500 new teachers in Portland Public Schools. The other 300 are more as a result of retirements and the rest. So, when we had the opportunity with additional money, that's where we put it. We added 2 days of school, and we added, 200 more teaching positions in the buildings. So we're trying to get there, but, we've had 10 years of cuts. Last year's was the first year of stability. So, we're actually in a really exciting place right now if we can all just hang on, because the economy is coming back, and, we got a great teacher contract where we added a lot of additional staff. We're trying to get workloads down for our teachers. So there's a lot of really good things happening, but we're coming out of a really deep decline in budgets for a long period of time.
But you also raised a
So
really
you're right,
important
though.
piece, around the facility challenges that we're facing.
And transfers, I just add that really quick. We've been accepting transfers when the school's already over capacity,
Yeah, that's one
which
we
is
should
a
think about,
huge
yeah.
issue. We
That
should
shouldn't be
not,
happening.
all these certain schools are closed, but Capitol's accepting transfer students. When our classes are huge and we have no more additional space.
Right. And a lot of, I mean, I think just about every building, K-5s in this cluster, with possible exception of Markham, I mean, built really small,
Yeah.
and the building size
Yeah,
is
they're
not
old,
there.
yeah.
So, and a lot of other buildings in the district as well, but particularly in this part of town, it's just a real challenge, and they're located much farther apart.
Yeah.
So there aren't any easy answers for any of this. And obviously, many years ago, there was the closure of Smith, and now we're turning back around in enrollment to the point where we're feeling the pain of over-enrollment rather than the pain of dropping enrollment and closing schools. So even though it's overall we're in a better place, it's very painful at the individual school level in a lot of cases. We should probably move on because you would face
Well, and I kind of go on. I'm also at Capitol Hill with a kindergartner and a second grader in classes of 31 each. And I posed the questions to the building of Stevenson. I'm on the board of Stevenson, and Stevenson's kindergarten, they have 2 of 18 each. And I posed the question, why can't I was volunteering, I'll bus my kid to Stevenson. The bus goes by my house, same as Capitol Hill, and there's a lot of us on the border that would be willing to move. But that transfer process was back in March, and we can't do anything about it. And that seems really silly because in the past, I've heard many situations where schools have bused a whole class of kids to another school where there was room to alleviate the problem now instead of in a year or 2 after there's a lot of discussion. I'm a teacher, so I know the process well. Anyways.
Yeah.
It takes forever to go through a process, but why is it that we can't just solve the problem when there is a solution for Capitol Hill right now? The second grade has 24 kids there and 31 at Capitol Hill with a 2.5 second grades and 2.5 third grades. And anyway, so I'm just I'm trying to look at some creative solutions, and I'm wondering if the board can help look at some of those solutions that could be done now.
Well, I think that's really, I mean, it's not something that we typically don't get involved down at the school level, that type of issue, but I think that's something that staff could take back to the area director, they are the ones who are involved working with the principals to figure these pieces out.
Well, I was told it wasn't a school level decision, so that's why.
Well, but I mean, but the person the next level up at the district, I mean, that's who we look to when we hear the individual issues from schools, which of course we do all the time. We aren't the ones who are in there day to day figuring this out, so I definitely would want them to weigh in. I mean, right now we do have, so we have the Superintendent's Advisory Committee on Enrollment and Transfer that's looking at the very issue around neighborhood to neighborhood transfers, hardship appeals, using the equity lens, and is this, we need to update our policy. So that's one piece that's coming, knowing that alone isn't going to fix all these issues, but it's an important piece, as well as the PSU and the kind of broader conversation that I mentioned before, which doesn't give you an immediate answer or solution. I know that staff is sort of triaged, being a growing district, we're now in a position with some buildings that are just, I mean, we've got kids at 3 different buildings because of overflow. So my sense of it is that staff has really been triaging and trying to, what they call it, the hot spots, but the very worst, but that doesn't alleviate the fact that it's, again, there's issues all across the district like the one you're talking about. So here and then.
I also have a daughter who's going to be in Capitol Hill next year, so probably a few of us here. I guess I'm wondering, and I heard about the class sizes, 3 of them of 30 plus, and it sounds like there's a solution coming maybe later rather than sooner?
Well, I mean, in the case of a smaller building where you're out of room, and potentially it would have to be boundary changes. Well, portables are an expensive solution. That's always on the list as a possibility. They are expensive, but a boundary solution would be another approach. A boundary change with the boundaries.
Could I ask, with your kindergarten child in a class of 30, do you have an education assistant in that classroom?
They've just got 2 educational assistants for the 3 kindergartens, so they're sharing them.
Okay, because that was certainly our understanding, is that we were trying to keep them 25 or below, or an education assistant comes in.
But that doesn't really do.
No, it's not ideal, obviously, but.
I mean, it helps.
Right.
Okay, so I think the pink, and then I'm
What
sorry, the lady here was first.
Not to echo everything that's been said with the elementary level, but we're in the Hayhurst district, and I have a child that's going to be going to Hayhurst, and a lot of the parents in the neighborhood are they have kindergartners and first graders, and again, the 30-plus size. We also have the added situation of Odyssey being K through 8 inside of the building. So, you know, it's my understanding, it's just really scary as a parent that has children going into elementary. There's a lot of parents talking about trying to transfer them out to schools that have smaller, you know, like a Stevenson, or, you know, other places that are smaller classrooms, but it's a huge concern when you have kids going into elementary, when you're hearing 30 and 32 in kindergarten and first grade, and wondering about, you know, is there talk about opening some of the schools like Smith or, you know, other schools that have closed to accommodate all those other scenarios?
I haven't heard that so far. I mean, things certainly down the horizon. There's a few buildings that have been closed that would potentially be reopened. I know for the main thing that's been talked about for Smith, though, would be, since we're fortunate to have the capital bond, as we start rebuilding schools, we do want to have a place that's fairly close by for students to go to while their school is being rebuilt. That's the main thing that I have heard. But certainly, if the growth continues the way it is, I mean, we're running out of space for sure, and totally hear your concerns about that.
I want to highlight, not that this will be lost on anybody, and we don't want, I don't know anybody that says, oh, 30 with 31 is okay, that we are trying to alleviate that, and it's good to hear exactly where it's happening, Hayhurst, Capitol Hill. But I also want to note that this also slightly changes a little bit depending on the economy. And the reason I say that is because there was a school in Southeast, also actually in Ruth's zone, Llewellyn, who was overcrowding, and they were busting at the seams. And so 2 years ago, before we decided to take this district-wide look at boundaries, they did a boundary adjustment with a neighboring school. And in the past 2 years, they're starting to see relief. They're starting to see a lowering of the number of students. What that has meant is they've lost 2 teachers. And now they're really upset because they're like, how can we be losing teachers? Remember that we use a formula that bases funding on the number of kids in your school, and so they're getting frustrated. And so I saw some principals when they kept getting cuts, that they actually really wanted those kids because they could maintain offerings that was some semblance of an education that they wanted to offer the kids. And not that anybody wanted still 30 or 31 kids in their class, but it was a strategy. And now that we're beginning to reinvest in it, it becomes unbearable. And now we don't have space for the electives that we want. And now we have the funds that we could do an elective. It becomes a slight shift, and it's hard as a big system, right, with 85 schools to change on a dime with facilities that were built 60 to 100 years ago. With this idea that everybody was walking to school, except in the Southwest, which was still driving, but still small neighborhood schools.
No sidewalks, but that's another issue.
Right.
Yes, ma'am.
So I'm a Capitol Hill parent with a first grader and a fifth grader as well. And the fifth grader has 33 to 35 kids in his class. So what is involved in the boundary change? And if we did a boundary change and we reduced class sizes to a reasonable amount of 25 kids, why would it be possible to lose teachers? It still seems that there would be enough funding at 25 children per class to have enough teachers in the school.
So the student-teacher ratio is what determines funding, and typically you're going to end up having to fund your extra teachers, your enrichment teachers out of that same pot of funds. And so some principals will choose to have higher individual class sizes so that they can offer more enrichments. Some will choose to have less enrichments and then have lower class sizes. And some of that's dependent on the building and what you actually have the capacity to do anyway. And that's sort of gets back to the question that we heard earlier about, you know, your top down and what you're going to do, because I suppose we could say nobody has more than 25 kids in a class, but what you're probably going to lose is an enrichment teacher or 2 in that process. And so, and every class is always, I mean, every school is going to always have some flexibility in terms of their class sizes. So, I mean, the good news is that our enrollment is going up. That means more dollars into the system to allow for more opportunities and more enrichment. A lot of times where we are now compromised is the size of our buildings themselves, and then what that causes us to have to do. One of the things in terms of our one-time funds that just we were just talking about is we are, I believe, looking at the potential of putting some more portables throughout the system next year. Every time you do a portable, it's about a $500,000 expense. That's 2 classrooms. And you also then need to have a place for it where it doesn't compromise, you know, your play structures or your fields or whatever. So it's not an ideal solution, but it may be the solution that we are going to be coming up with in the next couple of years as we wait for our bond funds to go through and start rebuilding as we go.
And portables is real, I mean, they're really modular buildings. I mean,
Yeah.
the requirements of the city.
They're actually really nice.
Yeah, yeah, the cost is high because the city requires such a high level of code and reviews and everything else, but they're actually fairly permanent once they go in.
Change in process, reviewing boundaries, is that
Yes.
like a 1-year process, is that a 10-year process?
Well, there hasn't been like a regular coherent district-wide boundary review process, and that's the goal. It's been sort of one-offs, and one of the big criticisms has been, because there's been like super severe issues in one area, but obviously anytime you change a boundary, not only does it create a lot of angst and concern, but it just has ripple effects because it obviously affects the surrounding districts. So one of the big things we heard in their most recent kind of major boundary review process was this really needs to be a district-wide discussion and to be a holistic piece. So on the one hand, that means we need to move a little slower to be able to figure that out, and that's why we brought in PSU to help us figure out how to do that. A lot of other districts do it on a regular basis, and it's something that's just very normalized, and that's where we want to get to. But it's going to take a lot of work and time to get to that point, a couple of years, I would say, probably before we really kind of have it rolling. In the meantime, we've got, again, you know, issues in every part of the district that are just severe and cannot wait, even more severe, I would venture to say, than some of the ones you brought up tonight. I mean, just because they're just really pressing. So we're trying to figure out that balance of moving quickly to be able to relieve some of those, but also be able to say, we're actually trying to do this in a systematic, thoughtful way that has buy-in from folks.
And our current thinking right now is that the district-wide would be in place for 16, 17, that'll have been thought. And then what we will have done as part of that process is talk with our community about how often do we revisit these and what does that mean? Because it may or may not surprise you, like I thought it was really generous. There's not every community where some parents are like, you know, I'm right on the boundary, I'm happy to go to that school if you want. There are some people who believe that because they've had generations, which understandably so, my mom, my dad, my grandpa, I went to that school and I go to that school, don't change me. And so that hasn't become a norm for us, even though it is, again, in neighboring districts. And so we have to, again, we want to engage our community to figure out what feels right, because people do make home purchases based on the school. I mean, those are real lifelong decisions. So we don't want to, you know, cast it off as if it's not to be considered. At the same time, when you guys, I mean, tears is a very appropriate reaction, right? It's your one kid, it's your 2 kids, one chance through the system. This is not something to take lightly. So we want to engage in that.
One of the big things also with when we're looking at boundary changes is you want to make sure, again, it gets back to the issue of what is being offered at each of the schools, and is it an equitable offering? Is it as attractive in this school as it is in this school? And we went through a process a few years ago called high school system design, and that was the intent of that process, was to try to make sure that every school was large enough that we could offer a really enriched and robust program. The last 2 things in the high school redesign that we hadn't accomplished yet was to get the counselor to student ratio down from 400 to 1 to 301. We did that this year finally. And career technical education offerings in each one of our high schools. So we're getting that, we're starting to get that into place. But that gets back to how much does the board and the superintendent say, you will have this and this and this, and how much do you want some of our high schools to have a little bit of their own personality? You know, this one has a little more focus on technology, this one a little more on career technical education, this a little bit more on music, whatever it might be. But what I think we want to do is establish that you can expect that when you go to high school in Portland Public Schools, you will have these offerings. And what we're looking at now, once we finish that sort of high school redesign, that's really what we're doing now with the K-8 system, is we're kind of looking at the whole K-8 system and trying to kind of figure out that same thing. What is the baseline that every parent in Portland Public School can and should expect throughout K-8, and how are we gonna get there?
Well, and again, to be fair, that some of this exists. We have these models in place, but what happened is that we've been in recession and we've been cutting everything. And so even I think of high school redesign, it wasn't that we didn't have a vision for what high school should be, it's that we couldn't fund the model as it was supposed to. And so there was a lot of twisting and contorting that has to happen to try to make it look like it's, try to get students everything that they need when everybody recognized that it wasn't anywhere close to what was necessary. And so that's when, for example, the complaint was filed, right? Districts throughout the state said, oh my gosh, none of us are providing that amount of stuff. And so people began applying waivers. It wasn't a one district choice. Folks had made choices to try to make best do with what was the problem in a situation where the state acknowledges they weren't funding it. And the only way I see that changing, local option levy this fall, and us continuing to not let the legislature, because my experience with the state legislature is they will respond when they hear it consistently across the community. If they hear one group or one vocal group, they think it's a special interest group motivating for whatever. But when folks came and they were rallying downtown, when folks were at the legislature and it was across the state, they listened, they began to change. And I just think it requires more of that.
So this gentleman.
I'm curious about your graduation rate. It shows this picture here and says that in 2009, 2010 you had a 67, so that was the class, I guess, an entering class, right? And you had a 67% graduation. But the over on the far side, you show the graduation rate for Benson, Lincoln, Cleveland, Grant, Swan, and none of them, oh yes there is, there's just one, and Madison apparently is less than 67%. The rest of them are all in their 80s. How can that be?
So thank you.
Great question.
Yeah, great question. So, so we have a number of alternative programs in the district, as well as charter schools. And so the 67% is the overall number across the entire district.
Well, but they're not shown here then, huh?
Yeah, I think it's the all PPS. Yeah, so we could break out in here all other high school programs.
All PPS is 67%, right?
Right. So.
And that's what you're showing for everybody.
Right.
How can that be?
So one of the things I always like to explain to people is how we come up with our graduation rate, just to start the conversation. So it used to be that when a student entered their senior year of high school in September, you would measure whether they graduated 9 months later. And that was our graduation rate. And so in Portland Public Schools, our graduation rate was like 90-something%. Many years ago, we decided that a more honest look at our graduation rate would be to look at a student coming in 9th grade in September, and do they graduate 4 years later? And that's where this number comes out, because in fact, you lose kids along the way. I would actually like us to see it tracked from 7th grade on
So
instead.
It doesn't work. Doesn't work. It doesn't work with what you're telling us here.
Right. So what ends up happening here is, as kids are struggling in different at different times during their high school career, we have other options that they look at and that we look at, including a whole network of community-based alternative programs that we contract with to help. And we have about 2,500 of our high school kids are in community-based alternative programs. So there is a big discussion going on as to whether or not we should be figuring out, for example, Hillsborough has something called care teams in each of their high schools, where they have a social worker and a variety of people who are focused right at each individual high school level to do all the wraparound supports for the child that our community-based alternatives are trying to do instead. And again, that ends up being a funding issue. But I think to answer your question, if you look at our community comprehensives, the kids that last all the way through there, that's the rate you're seeing. But many of those kids are moving from those schools and not being successful in those schools, and then moving into community-based alternatives that we contract with. And those are kids who are struggling. I mean, they have been struggling in our traditional high schools. They continue to struggle. and we're trying to give them more supports.
I'm not
So can I-
objecting to.
So, and the numbers happen once they move from the community high school to another program, they're no longer counted in that high
That's
school
not,
one,
that's
right?
what I was just gonna correct. So there are a couple of things I think that get to yours. So there are a couple of alternative schools that are not on this list. Alliance High School.
That's true.
And if you look at Madison, Roosevelt, and Jefferson, they're all in the 60%. So when you combine all of those together, that drags, I don't wanna say drags it, but it brings us down to 67%. And I just wanted to correct that when a student enters one of our comprehensive high schools, even if they go to a community-based organization, their score 4 years later still gets attached to that community-based high school.
Yeah.
What also winds up bringing us way down is students who join us in halfway through their 9th grade, 10th grade, 11th grade year, because that's where they start, and then they have the 3 years or the 2 years to catch up. And that's when you'll hear community-based organizations have graduation rates of 9%. Now that will change that percentage in a hurry, right? They're at 9%. Those are students who weren't with us since their 9th grade year. And so it becomes a numerical, you're right to look at this and say numbers aren't quite adding up, but when you take all those students together, it does wind up to be 67%. But also, I appreciate your acknowledgement that if you look at the comprehensive high schools, it's not as dire as some folks would have you believe.
Well,
And if you look
I
at a
guess
5-year graduation rate, it's closer to
my point-
80%.
My point from the beginning is that you gave us information here that
Yeah.
doesn't match,
Adds it up.
doesn't
I
work.
get it, right.
And that's why I had the question. And the second question, I can't have it 2 questions or something.
We're still going.
We
We
talked
waited
a
a long
lot.
time.
I am frustrated because I see all this money being spent to upgrade our high schools, and I hear all these people in this room telling me that there's not enough money being spent in the 1st, 2nd, 3rd grades. And I agree with that totally. I think that I hate to say this, but I think you mismanaged, you missed the goal. The goal is, in my opinion, to get the kids a great start in their school, encourage everything, bring them along, and carry them through the 8th grade. If you do that, then the vast majority of them are going to be ready for high school, and your high school graduation rate will go up automatically. But to see that you're going to rebuild Grant, for example, when they need, they got 30 kids in a classroom, my God, why are you doing that?
Well, keep
Different
in mind
kinds of
that
money.
the capital dollars are different, that's a separate set of money than the operating for the class. So totally hear what you're saying. I
Well,
mean, so
Those are dollars, and it's money being spent in the school board, and so you gotta make your plans. And I think your goal is, I've heard this constantly, and the goal is to get that graduation rate up, get it up.
Yep.
But you can't get it up if you're not spending your money on the
younger kids.
1st, 2nd, and 3rd grades. Well, then why aren't you spending that on the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd grades?
So I don't disagree. There are lots of tensions here. One is, as I mentioned before, state has rules about how much high schoolers and elementary and middle schools have to attend school. PPS was found out of compliance, so we've had to invest more at the high schools recently. But I don't disagree with you that I would prefer a strategy at investing early on. And I want to re-highlight that the state won't allow us, you all just passed a bond, a capital bond for us to rebuild buildings to address some of the facility issues. Those are by law, they cannot be spent in the classroom.
Yes, yes.
So
but
no general fund dollars that we're putting in programs are being used for those facilities.
But you brought the bond. You
Right.
brought the bond. You said, this is what we need. We need $500 million. And okay, they gave it to you, and you get a great new football field.
Different funds.
Yeah.
Also different funds.
How much is the roof in this at Wilson High School cost?
Oh,
3
gosh.
million, about $3 million.
3 million?
Yeah.
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 And it was leaking into this building, because I've been in this building when it's been
But,
leaking into
but
the
it goes back to the point that we brought the bond because we knew that we had facility needs, and the only way we can do not the only way, the wisest choice is to use money that can only be used for facilities is to use facility funding,
Yeah.
so that we could save the money that comes from the state to invest in the programs.
Okay.
So we could have ignored the facility, but then we'd still have bad facilities and still not be addressing the K3.
And in terms of the facilities bond, just so you know, we have 8 years of summer work projects that includes seismic upgrades so our kids can be safer, and roof upgrades, accessibility upgrades so the buildings can be accessed. We're adding some elevators in some buildings and the rest. And you're right, we have 3 high schools and then one, we actually have a Fabian K-8, which is being built with Concordia University. Concordia came to us and said they wanted to do a capital campaign to raise $5 to $7.5 million. And so with that partnership, they're actually building their School of Education at Concordia K-8, which is just an absolutely amazing opportunity. But to answer your question, it's a completely separate pot of money. You should know that in terms of our superintendent's priorities for this year and where we're investing money, one of her top 3 priorities is to ensure that 100% of our 3rd graders are reading by the end of 3rd grade, and that would be within the next 2 years. We also have another priority around disproportionate discipline and exclusionary discipline. Portland Public Schools is out of line in terms of where we should be on that. And the 3rd priority is around high school graduation. So it's not an either or, it's a both and. I mean, you can't, but you're right. I mean, you have to have the strong foundation as you go, or the kids aren't going to make it.
Back to Mike.
So I wanted to come back to one of Will Fuller's points that I didn't hear you respond to, and that's the equity funding. Now, as I understand it, if you don't have something like 30% of your students in poverty, you get nothing. And it seems to me that it ought to be on a per student basis, so even if you have a limited number of students in need, they should get some support. Because here in Southwest Portland, there's almost nothing for students that are in need, right? We have the Sun School at the middle school level, and that's it. Our principal has been over on the east side in one of these high poverty schools. They get 40 or 50 federal programs, they get all sorts of extra funding from PPS, and it just seems to me it ought to be on a per student basis. Why is it not?
I think the formula does take into account per student.
Well, not the federal programs, but the
Yeah,
the
the equity.
match of
Yeah.
Right.
historically underserved and
Right.
SES is part of the funding formula per child.
Yeah, that is per child.
So, but you're not going to get as much if you don't have as many low-income kids. You're not going to get as many of those funds, but it is
So there's a
it is
cutoff where you don't
done
get any.
disproportionate. It is done proportionally.
Yeah.
There's
But through our racial educational equity policy, I mean, it's just there are students that the district has been failing for decades. And so the equity formula is an attempt to try to begin to level the playing field. It is a per student, but it does definitely end up with less money for schools that have a smaller proportion. That's always been a challenge, particularly for schools that have sort of like a relatively small number of kids in poverty versus the critical mass, where absolutely there are, you can leverage a bunch of different funds. At the same time, of course, a lot of those funds or grants come with all kinds of compliance requirements and mandates, that it's not necessarily a picnic for principals to be able to spend and apply those for kids either. But we're recognizing that we failed a lot of our kids in every part of this district, but just the way the demographics of our city and the history of the way things have grown up, there's concentrations of poverty in some parts of our city. So we're recognizing that we do need to put additional funds for those
Then what you're saying is if you're a poor person, you better move to one of those places, because that's where you can get help. You can't get it here in Southwest, even though we've built a lot of low-income housing.
I appreciate what you're saying. It's just a little bit of a misnomer. So, for example, you have Stevens Crossing, which just recently opened. We provided additional support both at the middle school and at Hayhurst and a number of things. So, to characterize it that way is a little bit black and white, a little extreme. It's not quite that. There's definitely a disparity. And I've heard in schools in Southwest to say, boy, a student here who is at the poverty line is going to have a harder time than in a school with high poverty. I can't disagree with that, but I also don't, there's not an easy fix to that. We can't pull them away from a high poverty where they do need support it does give a proportional amount, and I hear you saying that it doesn't feel like enough, and I think that's a theme that we've heard in Oregon education for quite some time. There's not enough. I haven't heard anybody talk about TAG, right? I mean, are we losing the kids that are supposed to be advancing? What are we doing to invest in TAG? We're at 75% of the funding that the state by law is required to fund, but because they have a safety valve of, or we can report on it, they don't have to fund it. Other states have taken their state legislature to court and won. State of Washington, they have billions of dollars that the state legislature has to pay. So again, I don't want to keep passing this off. I hear what you're saying. We do accommodate for it. I hear that it's not enough, and I agree.
Folks who we haven't heard from yet?
Can people behind the camera talk?
Yeah, I was going to try not to, but I have a technology question. You guys brought that up real early on, and I think on April 16th at the board meeting, you were presented by central staff about how we're going to deal with the testing. And you guys were asking questions of the staff, I think Melissa Goff, and what does our technology look like across the district? Because doesn't seem like, my particular school is dealing with 9-year-old, unsupported XP machines, and then I hear stories of people that are going to be taking tests on new iPads. So a couple of you asked the question, can we get like an inventory? And I heard that at the beginning of this meeting too. We need to get back to where we know what is going on in our schools. How's that coming? Like, do we know yet? How's that? Has the staff gotten any answers for you?
My understanding is it's in the recommendation for the superintendent's one-time only money proposal that we're about to talk about tomorrow.
Okay.
So, listen to our discussion tomorrow about how that's coming. But I'm going to just piggyback on that point because part of that conversation was also a question of the new assessment tests, and not only are they more they challenge students in a different way with what they're asking students to do, but they're also really technology heavy, meaning that students, rather than write their response, will have to type their response. 3rd grade, type your response. They'll have to click and drag, draw lines, all with mouse manipulation. So we have real concerns. In fact, you might have seen an article in the Oregonian that we are considering, tomorrow night we'll be talking about it, considering not making targets for our 3rd, 5th, and 8th graders, or 7th, 6th graders.
5th and 8th for math.
And that's partly twofold. One, the state can't provide us any information what a realistic target is. So when other states have piloted these, or when they've rolled out these tests, about 30% of their kids have passed. 30% of the new assessments is what we're expecting to pass, but that's just a guess on what other states have done. Traditionally, we've been setting targets at 100%, 80%, 70%, so we've asked which end of the spectrum do we go with, knowing that some of the kids are even in struggle typing their answer in, right? And so we're struggling with, the state can't provide us that information, and they're not going to provide it for us before about March, and they'll test in May, but they're asking us to set our targets now. And so we're stating back to the state, you know what, this isn't reasonable. We don't know what targets to set. If you could give us a benchmark, and that's aside from whether or not this is the first year of the test, we don't know if they're reliable. We don't know we don't know anything about the test. It's proprietary information. It's owned by the company that exists, or that's doing the test. So they haven't let us look at the tests. They have some samples online. So we're struggling as a board to figure out, how do we set aspirational goals? How do we hold ourselves accountable? How do we keep making the progress that we've been making? And I mean, we'd pick a number out of a hat tomorrow to figure out what we're put on these achievement tests scores, and then we don't know what the state will do. Well, you missed the you missed the mark. Will we be punished for that? We don't know. They won't tell us. They can't tell us. So
we used to use something in Oregon called an Oaks test, and now we're switching over to something called the Smarter Balanced test. So that's the discussion. You'll hear a lot about Common Core. The bigger issue is the assessment or the test that's going to be used with our kids. And one of the other issues that we have with as many emerging bilingual students as we have is that the test is only given in English. And so, how are our children who don't know English going to do on that, and what kind of penalties will there be for their results? So, yeah, there's a lot of huge issues. And, you know, the other thing is we really don't anymore teach typing skills. And so if you're supposed to type in a response, you know, how long, it may be that a student knows exactly what the answer is, but they're, you know, trying to figure out how to type it in when they're not particularly familiar, especially with maybe a poor kid who doesn't have a computer at home. You know, we have to spend time prepping them to do test taking rather than learning. So it's an issue.
And I was just talking to, I'm sorry to belabor the point, but I was just talking to a principal in another district who was talking to some folks in Oregon City, and they also piloted some of the tests. And the state's saying that the test should take about 8 or 9 hours to administer. And their experience in Oregon City when they piloted the test was that it took about 18 hours to administer. And so it's just really challenging. I personally don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. We asked the state in a resolution in July if they would hold off on using the results for the assessment for any kind of judging or evaluating. They came back and said no. In fact, we just got an email this evening when we said some of us asked, well, what happens if we don't set targets for those? Like, what will the state do to us? And they basically came back and said, you won't be able to submit your targets in compliance with state law because it has to have a numerical value between 0 and 100% or something like that. So,
I mean, I think for us it boils down to this is a huge transition for our state, right? To be able to have a new assessment and to move towards these new standards. And I feel like that's moving in the right direction. I am not sorry to see the last of the Oaks test. But none of us, and we said very clearly in the resolution, we're not about teaching to the test. We want to have education for the whole child. And there's huge challenges with the state in professional development for our teachers, the technology, all those other pieces. So this is a huge transition, and we feel like this needs to be seen as a transitional period, and the state needs to allow for that. So we've said it through the means we have
as
to
clearly
it.
as we can.
As clear as we can in a fairly lengthy and detailed resolution, which you can find online. Share that with the powers that be at the state and federal level. But they're moving forward, right? The train is out of the station. So it's going to be something that, you know, it's going to be huge, obviously, for our teachers, our students, our families. So we're going to continue to raise our concerns with those who are
So
in
you've
charge.
got a participation target.
Yeah, well, yeah, that's another issue.
The state,
5% pass.
The state already requires a participation requirement, so that's.
Yeah, that's one of the accountability pieces in the achievement compact. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, that's what I wondered. What happens if you set your expectations so low that you're absolutely certain to meet them and exceed them?
I think they'll reject them and send them back to us.
Keep in mind, the governor has said 40-40-20, 100%. You know, he set the goal that 100% of our kids. Obviously, we all want to get there, right? But to be able to get to that point, I mean, it's the Oregon Education Investment Board is sort of the new body that's in charge, and they are. We're trying to share our concerns as we go. Let me just put it that way.
That's a strategy, is that we could set them at 5%, right, and say, hey, look, we got 7%.
I wasn't.
Yeah.
Do you really feel that you might be as low as 7%?
I don't think it.
I think the point is we have no way of knowing.
And by setting them very low this year and then higher next year, and so
well, we're back. We're required. We're back mapping from 100% in is it 2025. And in order to get to that level for graduation rate, which obviously we want to do, and we're focusing a ton of resources and attention on that, but to be able to get there, the growth has to be accelerated.
And there were districts last year that set what the state considered too low of targets, and they actually sent them back and said redo them. So.
But there are many things that go slowly and then right up, and if the state hasn't given you adequate either time or information to prepare reasonably, plan to start really slowly, and then in the last 3 years.
That is absolutely a strategy.
And we do actually think that our overall graduation rate and achievement is going to start accelerating as we have a little bit more money and investment in the system.
Once you know what's expected.
Right. More teachers.
And make clear what is required in the way of technology and whatnot.
Right. I think we've been trying to do that.
Yeah. So
This hits really to some key educational values. One of them being what's authentic assessment.
Right.
And I quite agree that given the reliability status of these tests, put them off for a while and talk about what you really do, which ties into something of motivation. With overwhelmed principals, teachers with their heads spinning with new things, and kids wondering why go to school because there's nothing for me there, we are killing motivation, which is absolutely essential to get something learned.
Yeah,
So
joy
I
in learning.
I concur with that, thinking in terms of whatever we're doing, dealing with what is the most effective, proven way of getting the education results. One being well-prepared teachers who are supported when they go into class. Is where I would put some priority money no matter what level.
Right.
And really talk about this as an education issue rather than piecemeal testing, creating, technology and stuff.
Right. Yeah, we had the Achievement Compact Committee, which was the mandated body to work on this, which we were able to add, even though the state doesn't. We allowed ex officio. I think we had it was PTA and
communities of color.
And communities of color, even though the state doesn't officially let that to happen. But anyway, that group working with the teachers came forward, and they're the ones who have said to us, based on the guidance from your resolution, we're recommending that you not set these targets because of the concerns. And it was really great to have both teachers and staff together presenting to us, and they came up with a whole long list of all the things along the lines, the joy of learning and the other pieces that we need to be seeing. And obviously we agree with that, but it's figuring out, given the sort of the direction and the mandates that we need to respond to, how we're gonna work through it. So
I also just want to caution a little bit. You use the term authentic assessment, and that means something very specific to educators.
I use that specific term.
Right. Okay. And I just wanted to point out that when I first came to Oregon, they had just changed to something more authentic assessment, the SIM-CAM, where you could put portfolios of work, and that came and went. It wasn't as effective as people were hoping. So there is no silver bullet. I think to your point about how do we still instill motivation, how do we continue the joy of learning, how do we effectively measure progress, and how do we support our teachers. So this last year, again, as we saw the budget improving, we put in additional money for what's called our teacher mentoring program, so that especially new teachers would come in and feel supported. And we took teachers, they can't be effective teachers that were doing well, that were interested in mentoring other new teachers, and they can't be out of the classroom for any more than 3 years to make sure that they're still fresh and they experience what it was like in the classroom. So absolutely, we have to support our teachers, and that's where we're investing.
Before too many more people leave,
Yeah.
I want to do one more little quick thing here. The Portland Council PTA has endorsed the levy, and if you're interested in any further information about that, Otto, who's in the back there, will be in the front of the school with stuff you can get and take home. This is from the PTA, not from PPS, and we can't say anything more than that because we're in an official PPS meeting, but we do want you to not walk away without some resources if you would like them, and we will provide them.
And also, before we wrap up, I just wanted to make sure that you know that Superintendent Smith has been here all night, listening to all of your questions and concerns. We also have John Isaacs, who's with our communications department, and Roseanne is our new school board manager. So if you ever have any questions or you want to sign up to testify at a school board meeting or whatever, she's your person as well. So, yeah.
Any final comments or questions before we wrap up? I think Michael and Scott.
You heard from me. I just want to point out, this is all connected. I mean, the testing drives the choices that principals make.
Yep.
It's why we don't have PE or music or art. And that's been in large part district driven for years. So, you guys are putting up a little bit of resistance to this, the smarter balance test. That's so Orwellian. Do more. I mean, my kids graduated. If I had a kid who was going to be subject to 19 hours of testing, I would be signing that release form so quickly I wouldn't put my kid through that.
Michael?
Well, I have a slightly different lemons to lemonade take. Certainly there's a short-term issue. and particularly as you point out for kids having typing skills or the ability to draw lines using a mouse and so on. But frankly, those are skills that are very apropos in the workplace.
Absolutely.
I would encourage you, I was really impressed. I went to the PTA meeting at Robert Gray last week. Beth Madison and her technology lead is a teacher named David Kennedy. And using some Chromebooks that were purchased by the parents, they've really put together a nice program with technology where they are learning keyboarding. They are learning a whole bunch of other things you can do with computers. He tries to tie it, I mean, as anybody who has kids know, video games are very popular, and that might even get at Will's joy of learning kind of thing.
Right.
So I think there may be an opportunity, although it's a struggle in the short term, to really teach some skills that will be very useful to kids, and also that could be fun.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that.
So I encourage you to talk to Beth, talk to David Kennedy.
Aaron had a
Well, I was just going to say, I really love Bobbie's idea of setting the targets at 100% and just sending those back in. I would really support that. And I really was worried about listening to board meetings and these testing issues for probably 18 months now at this point, because since 2010, there's been some early implementation back east that's not going well at all. It's not been encouraging. And I would hate to see us walk right into that. So I think there would be very many people that would support you against the state if you want to push back a little bit on the state. So, and thank you for doing what I'm hearing you do.
Wow. So, Autumn, final?
So, as one of the people who did participate in the conversation around the whole rollout of testing and achievement compacts, the most powerful thing that came out of that is the litany of other things that you should be looking at.
Right.
And you have a little bit of additional revenue that you should prioritize some things. I'm glad to hear some of them mentioned tonight. But what came out over and over, particularly from the principals, was the need for wraparound services. So the kids that are really struggling, the kids that we are obsessing about are they going to get through the milieu and get out of school into adulthood, they are kids who would benefit most greatly from wraparound services and a focus on the whole child. And so when you have an opportunity to do that, go with it, because I do believe that the broader public will understand and support you. I think that it is too easy to get preoccupied with numbers. We all do it. Numbers are important, but they aren't the only thing.
Right.
And the Achievement Compact discussions were profound because there were people who never agree on the majority of things in the room agreeing on litany that you have. So go over those carefully, and to the extent that you can invest in them, please do.
Yeah, thank you. That was hugely valuable to hear that. And thank you for your work on the committee. So I just thank you everybody for coming out tonight. And thank you for Carol for being here and staff for organizing this. There's going to be more, John. I don't know. We're going to get the word out, so there's going to be these around the district at the different high schools. Really appreciate hearing from you and just hearing both the high level and the very specific concerns that you have. So thank you so much. Any comments? All right. Thank you so much.